and keeps the truck moving. I started when I was 24, fresh out of a bad marriage with nothing to my name but a duffel bag and a commercial license. And I've driven every kind of road you can think of since then. Black ice in Wyoming that turned a 6-hour drive into a 14-hour crawl. Flash floods in Texas that swallowed whole underpasses in front of me. Wind in Oklahoma, strong enough to lay a trailer over if you are not paying attention. None of that ever really scared me, the way one night on Route 33 through the West Virginia mountains did, back in the fall of 2019. I want to set the scene a little before I get into what happened, because I think it matters. That part of West Virginia, once you get off the interstate, the roads narrow up fast and start climbing and dropping through terrain that was never really meant for an 18-wheeler. You get switchbacks tight enough that you are riding your Jake brake the whole way down, and the tree cover is so thick in places that even at noon, it feels like dusk under the canopy. I had run that route maybe a dozen times before that night, delivering to a furniture warehouse outside Elkins, and I never had a single bit of trouble with it before, other than the usual white knuckle grip you keep on tight mountain curves. It was late, past midnight, and I was trying to make a delivery window before sunrise, which meant pushing through a stretch of road I would normally have preferred to hit in daylight. The fog out there gets thick enough that your headlights just bounce it back at you like a wall, so I had my brights off and my low beams doing what work they could, crawling along maybe 35 miles an hour on a road with a 55 limit, hazards flashing in case anyone came up behind me. I remember the radio kept cutting out, no matter what station I tried. Classic rock, gospel, even the trucker's CB channel. Just static rolling in and out, like something was breathing on the frequency itself. I chalked it up to the terrain blocking signal. Mountains do that. Nothing unusual about losing radio in a deep holler. About 40 minutes into that stretch, somewhere past the little unincorporated crossroads that barely counts as a place, I saw something cross the road up ahead, caught for just a half second in my low beams before it vanished into the fog on the other side. At first I told myself it was a deer. We hit plenty of those out here. Insurance claims are practically a rite of passage for anybody who drives these roads long enough. But the shape was wrong in a way that stuck with me even before I had time to think it through logically. It moved on two legs, low and quick, covering the width of the road in maybe 3 strides. And it was tall, taller than any man has business being, with a silhouette that suggested something between an animal and a person that I did not want to look at too closely even in memory. I slowed down maybe too much, easing off towards 25. And right as I got close to where it had crossed, my engine just cut out. No warning light on the dash, no stutter or sputter working its way up to a stall. Nothing gradual about it at all, just dead, like someone reached under the hood and pulled a plug. I coasted the rig onto the shoulder in the fog with my heart going so hard I could feel it thudding in my ears, louder than the sound of my own tires crunching gravel as I rolled to a stop. I sat there for a second, trying to run through my mental checklist. Fuel, battery, electrical. But honestly, my mind was not really on the truck at all. It was on that shape crossing the road. I sat there for a second, trying to figure out what to do, hand hovering over the ignition key, not quite ready to try it again. And that is when I heard it on the roof of my cab. A scraping sound, slow, deliberate, like something was walking along the trailer roof, claws catching and dragging on the metal ridges with each step. I did not move. I did not breathe loud. I sat there with both hands white-knuckled on the wheel, staring straight ahead into fog that swallowed my headlight beams after maybe 30 feet, listening to whatever it was make its way from the back of the trailer toward the cab, unhurried, like it had all the time in the world and knew exactly where it was going. Then it screamed, and I want you to understand something, because I need you to know I am not exaggerating this part for effect. I have heard mountain lions scream before out on these roads. I've heard bobcats fighting, and I've heard every kind of animal noise this part of the country has to offer over 2 decades of driving through it at all hours. This was not that. It started low, almost like a woman crying, mournful and human enough that some deep animal part of my brain wanted to get out and help whoever was hurt. and then it climbed higher and higher into something that did not sound like it was coming from outside the truck at all anymore. It felt like it was inside my skull, vibrating behind my eyes, a pressure as much as a sound. I grabbed my tire iron off the passenger floor, more out of instinct than any real plan, because what exactly was a tire iron going to do against something the size of what I had glimpsed crossing that road? The scraping moved from the roof down the side of the trailer toward my door, slow, and I remember the whole cab shifted slightly under the weight. A lean I felt through the frame, like something heavy had pressed its bulk against the driver's side. My door handle rattled, not shook from wind or vibration, rattled deliberately up and down, like fingers were testing whether it would give. I have never prayed so hard in my life, and I was not a particularly religious man before that night. I just kept saying please under my breath, over and over, please, please. Not even sure what I was asking for exactly. Just throwing the word out into the dark like it might mean something to whatever was standing outside my door. I could hear breathing now too, underneath the scraping, slow and deep. Deeper than any breath I'd ever heard come out of a living thing. I swear there was a wet quality to it, like it was breathing through something that was not quite a nose or a mouth, in any shape I would recognize. Then, just like that, the weight lifted off the truck. I felt the frame settle back level, and I heard something bound off into the tree line. Fast, faster than anything that size should be able to move, crashing through brush for maybe 2 seconds before the sound cut off entirely, swallowed by distance or by the fog itself. My engine turned back over about 90 seconds later on the first try, like nothing had ever happened. Dash lights coming up normal, gauges reading exactly where they should be. I did not stop again until I hit a gas station outside Elkins, driving the rest of that stretch faster than I should have, watching my mirrors more than the road ahead, honestly. When I got out to check the trailer under the station's fluorescent lights, my hands were still shaking bad enough that I dropped my keys twice trying to get them back in my pocket. There were 4 claw marks raked down the paint on the driver's side, deep enough you could catch your fingernail in them, starting up near the roofline and dragging down almost to the wheel well, space too wide for any bear or big cat I'd ever heard of. The gas station clerk, older guy, maybe 70, came out to check on me because I guess I looked as rattled as I felt. And he saw me standing there looking at those marks in the paint, and he just nodded slow, like he had seen this particular kind of shaken before. He told me that road does that sometimes, said it plain, no drama in his voice at all, and told me some folks up in these hollers still call it the Wampus, and that it has been seen going back before his granddaddy's time. Generations of stories about something that walks these ridges on 2 legs when it wants to, and 4 when it needs speed. He did not say it like he was trying to scare me or spin a tale for a rattled trucker looking for an explanation. He said it like he was just telling me the weather forecast for tomorrow, a fact of living in that particular corner of the world that everybody local just accepted and worked around. I still drive that route sometimes when the freight calls for it because a man has to work, and that road is still the fastest way to that warehouse. But I do not stop on the shoulder anymore, not for anything, not for a flat tire, not for a warning light, not for anything short of the truck being fully engulfed in flame. I will ride it in on the rim before I sit still on 33 after dark again. And I keep that tire iron a lot closer to hand than I used to, even though some nights, lying awake thinking about it, I know full well it would not have done a bit of good. If this one got under your skin like it did me telling it, do us a favor and smash that like button. It genuinely helps this channel more than you would think, and it costs you nothing but a second of your time. Drop a comment and let us know if you have driven that stretch of 33 yourself, or if your part of the country has its own version of this story, because we know these things do not stay in just one holler. If you have not subscribed yet, now is a good time because next week's story might just be worse than this one. And we've got plenty more of them lined up. Story 2. My name is Renee Castellano, and I work night shift as an RN at a small regional hospital in eastern Kentucky, right up against the Virginia line. Been doing it 11 years now, ever since I finished nursing school, and took the first job that would have me, which happened to be nights in a rural ER because nobody with seniority wanted that shift. You see a lot of strange things working nights in a rural hospital. People come in from accidents way out in the hollers, sometimes hours after it happened, because nobody could get a signal to call for help. Farm injuries that would make your stomach turn, overdoses, the occasional gunshot wound from a hunting accident, or something less accidental that nobody wants to talk about. But this story is not about a patient. This is about something that happened to me personally, driving home after one of the longer shifts of my career. I live about 25 minutes from the hospital, out past where the cell service drops off completely, on a road that follows the river for a while, before it climbs up into the ridge toward my house. I always leave around 6 in the morning after a 12-hour shift, so most of the drive happens right around sunrise, which is usually the safest time to be out. The theory being that whatever prowls at true midnight has usually gone to ground by the time the sky starts lightening. This was in February, still full dark at that hour though, the sun not due up for another hour and a half. Cold enough the road had black ice patches you had to watch for in your headlights. The telltale dark shine that looks almost like a wet patch until your tires catch it wrong. I was maybe halfway home, right past the turnoff for a little country church that had been closed and boarded up for as long as I had lived out there. Some congregation having dwindled to nothing a decade or more back, when I saw 2 kids standing at the edge of the road near the gravel lot. 2 kids maybe 8 or 9 years old, no coats on despite the cold, just standing there at the tree line in the dark, like they had been waiting. My first thought, the nurse thought, the mother thought, because I do have 2 kids of my own at home, was that something was wrong, and I needed to stop immediately. I slowed the car hard, tires catching gravel on the shoulder, and rolled the window down partway, already running through in my head what I would need, blankets in the trunk, my phone even though I knew the signal was spotty out there. One of them stepped forward toward my car and asked, in a voice too flat and even for a scared child standing in the cold, if I could give them a ride. Said their mom's car had broken down back at the church and she had sent them out to flag someone down for help. Normal enough words on the surface. It's the kind of thing you would expect a stranded family to say. But something about the way he said it did not sit right with me, even as I processed it. No shake in his voice at all. No shiver, despite standing coatless in February air that had my own car windows fogging from the cold. Just flat and rehearsed sounding, like a script he had recited before. I looked at his face under my headlights, really looked, because something in my gut was screaming at me to pay closer attention, even as my instincts to help fought against it, and his eyes were solid black, no white showing at all, not pupils dilated in darkness, the way a scared kid's might be, just solid black from edge to edge. And the same was true of the girl standing a few feet behind him, watching me with that same flat, unblinking stare. Every instinct in me, the mother instinct, the nurse instinct, trained over a decade to triage and act, wanted desperately to help what looked like a child in distress. But something older than that, something animal and buried deep, screamed the opposite, screamed at me to get away. And I have learned over the years to trust that particular voice even when I cannot explain it. I told him I was sorry, but I could not help right now, and I started rolling my window back up, hands not quite steady on the switch. He put his hand flat against my window glass as it rose, palm pressed there, and said in that same eerily calm voice, "You have to let us in. You have to invite us in." My skin went cold hearing that specific phrasing, "invite us in," like he was reciting something from an old rule he had memorized. Some condition that had to be met before whatever he actually was could cross a threshold he could not cross on his own. His palm print stayed fogged on my glass, even after I got the window fully closed, like his hand had been colder than the winter air outside. I did not wait to hear anything else or think it through any further. I hit the gas hard enough that my tires spun briefly on loose gravel before catching, and I did not look in my mirror until I was almost a mile down the road, hands shaking on the wheel the whole way. When I finally did check my mirror, The road behind me was completely empty. No kids, no broken down car, anywhere near that church lot, nothing at all. Like the entire scene had simply ceased to exist the moment I drove away from it. I called my sister the second I got signal back at the top of the ridge near my house, voice still shaking, and she went quiet on the phone for a long moment before telling me that her mother-in-law, who had grown up in that same county her whole life, had told her stories years back about black-eyed children showing up on that exact stretch of road, always near that same old church, going back decades, long before either of us had ever heard the term used online or anywhere else. My sister said her mother-in-law refused to drive that road after dark even to this day, had rerouted her entire commute decades ago rather than risk it. I still drive that road every night for work because I do not have another practical way to get to the hospital, the alternate route adding almost 40 extra minutes each way, but I do not roll my window down anymore, no matter who is standing there or how urgent they sound, and I keep my doors locked the second I pull off hospital property, checking them twice before I ever put the car in drive. I have also started keeping a rosary my grandmother gave me clipped to my rearview mirror, which I am not embarrassed to admit, because whatever helps me feel even a little safer on that drive is worth having within reach. If you have ever had a moment where your gut told you not to trust something that looked harmless on the surface, let us know in the comments. I would genuinely like to hear it, because I think more people have had these moments than ever talk about them out loud. Give this video a like if it kept you a little on edge. Hit subscribe if you are new here, and we will see you in the next one. Story 3. My name is Wendell Pruitt, and I keep bees, about 60 hives spread across 3 different properties in Pocahontas County, West Virginia. A business I built up slowly over almost 20 years, starting with 2 hives my father-in-law gave me as a wedding gift, half joking, half hoping I would fail at it and give up the hobby. Beekeeping is quiet work most of the time, early mornings before the heat comes up, careful hands, the low hum of the hives becoming a kind of background music you stop consciously noticing after a while. Nothing dramatic about it most days of the year. But in the summer of 2021, something happened out at my furthest hive site, up near the boundary of the state forest, that made me sell that piece of land entirely the following spring. Took a loss on it too, and I do not regret that decision one bit. I had hives set up in a small clearing about a half-mile hike from where I could park my truck. An old logging road from decades back got you most of the way, overgrown enough now that you had to walk the last stretch on foot, carrying your smoker and gear in a backpack. I would usually go check on that particular site every few days, more often during the height of the honey flow when the bees were working hardest, and problems could develop fast if you were not paying attention. One evening in late July, I stayed later than I meant to, lost track of time, working a stubborn situation with one of my queens, who seemed to be failing, needing to be replaced before the whole colony suffered for it. And by the time I finally packed up my gear, it was already going dusky under the thick tree cover, that particular blue-gray light that comes before true dark but after the sun has really given up on the day. Walking back down that logging road toward my truck, I started smelling something wrong before I heard anything at all. A heavy, wet dog smell at first, but worse than that, mixed with something rotten underneath it, like something dead that had been left out in the rain for days. Then I heard something moving parallel to me, in the thick brush off to my left, keeping pace with my walking speed almost exactly, not coming closer, just tracking alongside me step for step, brush rustling in a steady rhythm that matched my own footfalls a little too precisely for comfort. I stopped walking, testing something without fully realizing I was testing it. And the sound stopped too, a half-second delay before the silence, like whatever it was had needed a moment to register that I had halted. I got my flashlight up out of my jacket pocket with hands that were already starting to shake a little, and swept the beam toward the sound in the brush. And for maybe 2 full seconds, I had it lit up clear as day. It was on all fours, but built wrong for that posture somehow. Front legs noticeably longer than the back legs, giving it an odd uphill lean even on flat ground, covered in shaggy fur that was white in some patches and gray in others, matted down in clumps like it had been wet recently and never properly dried. It had horns, short and sharply curved, like you might see on a ram, but set wider apart on a skull that was too large and too long to belong to any ram I had ever seen at a county fair or a farm. It looked directly at me, with eyes that caught my flashlight beam and threw it back yellow. That reflective shine you get off deer or raccoons at night, except set at a height that put its head roughly level with my own chest. And I swear to you, standing there with my heart hammering, it smiled, if you can even call it that, pulled its lips back off a mouthful of teeth that had absolutely no business being in the mouth of anything I could name. Then it was gone into the brush. And I mean truly gone. Not the sound of something large crashing away through undergrowth, the way a startled deer or bear would move. Just gone. Like the deepening dark had reached out and swallowed it whole in an instant. No fading rustle, no snap of branches receding into distance. Just silence where, a moment before, there had been a very real, very large animal watching me from 15 feet away. I ran the rest of that logging road, tripped twice over roots I could not see clearly in the dying light, scraped my palm open on a rock, and did not even feel it until later. Did not care about any of it in the moment. Just got to my truck and locked the doors before I'd even gotten the key fully into the ignition. My hands were shaking so badly, it took 3 separate tries to get the key to catch. And I sat there in the driver's seat for a solid 2 minutes afterward, just breathing, engine running, doors locked, before I trusted myself to actually drive. I went back to that clearing exactly 1 week later in full daylight, brought my nephew along to help me load the hive boxes onto a trailer, and I did not tell him the real reason, just said I was consolidating my sites to save on travel time, which was not entirely a lie. We found tracks in the soft mud near where I had been standing that night, 5-toed, wide as a dinner plate, pressed deep enough into the ground that whatever left them carried serious weight, and a smear of something dark and half-dried on a nearby fence post that I made a point of not looking at too closely, steering my nephew toward the opposite side of the clearing without really explaining why. My nephew asked, poking at one of the tracks with a stick, if bears left prints like that around here, and I told him honestly that I did not know what left those tracks, and that was the God's honest truth, still is to this day. I still keep bees. It is a good chunk of my income, and something I genuinely love doing, but nothing goes up past that state forest boundary anymore. Not for any amount of honey, not for any price a buyer might offer me for a rare wildflower harvest from up that high. Some ground just is not worth working anymore, no matter what it might yield. If this one gave you chills the way it still gives me chills telling it, drop a like on the video. It costs nothing, and it helps this channel keep going more than you would guess. Tell us in the comments if you have ever smelled something in the woods before you ever laid eyes on it, because in my experience, that is usually the detail that stays with people the longest afterward. Subscribe if you have not already. More of these are coming every week. Story 4. My name is Curtis Boggs, and I worked underground coal for 18 years in southern West Virginia. Before the mine I was at finally shut down for good back in 2017, another casualty of a whole industry that has been shrinking my entire working life. Most people think the scary part of mining is cave-ins or gas buildup. And sure, that is real and it absolutely will kill you. If you get complacent, we lost 2 men from a neighboring crew to a methane pocket the year before I started. A story that got told to every new hire as a kind of warning. But there is something else that happens down there sometimes that nobody talks about much outside the crew itself, because who exactly is going to believe you? And more practically, who wants the company or their co-workers thinking they have lost their nerve underground? We called it Tommy knocking, the sound of something tapping on the rock. And old-timers always told new guys coming in that it was either a warning of a collapse building up somewhere in the strata, pressure shifting before rock gave way, or it was something that actually lived down there and did not much care for being disturbed by our drilling and blasting, depending entirely on which old-timer you happen to ask and how many years they had put in underground themselves. I worked with those sounds echoing through the tunnels for years, and mostly just ignored them, the way you learn to ignore anything that becomes routine. Figured it was settling rock, pressure differentials from the ventilation system, ordinary mine noise that a body gets used to the same way city folks get used to traffic outside their window. But there was one night shift, deep in a section we called the 7 East, roughly 2 miles back from the portal where daylight was nothing but a memory and a concept, where something genuinely different happened, different enough that even now, years removed from mining entirely, I still think about it more nights than I would like to admit. We were deep enough into that section that if your cap light died on you, you understood real fast and real personal what true darkness actually feels like, pressing in on every side. No light anywhere at all. Not a hint of it. Not even the kind of gray you get from a moonless night on the surface. Around 2 a.m, deep into that shift, our whole crew heard 3 slow knocks come from the rib wall to our left, evenly spaced, deliberate in a way that felt intentional rather than random, not the scattered tapping we had all grown accustomed to over years of working underground. Everybody stopped what they were doing at once, without a word passed between us, machinery idling but not shut down yet. Then we heard it again. 3 more knocks, same slow, deliberate spacing, but this time coming from directly above us, from the roof of the tunnel itself. My foreman, a man named Otha, who had put in over 30 years underground by that point, and was about as far from the type to spook easily as you could find in this line of work, told everybody flat out to shut their equipment down completely and just listen. We stood there in that tunnel, 6 of us, with our cap lights pointed every which direction, and heard breathing, slow and deep, coming from somewhere out past where any of our lights actually reached. Not a draft moving through the ventilation, not any piece of machinery cycling somewhere further down the line. Breathing, the kind with weight and rhythm behind it, that you only get from something alive. One of the younger guys on my crew, a kid maybe 22 years old who had only been with the company about 8 months at that point, said in a voice barely above a whisper that he saw something move at the very edge of his light beam, low to the ground, pale-colored, moving on what he swore afterwards, even sober and in daylight, were too many limbs for anything natural to possess. He would not go back into that particular section after that night, no matter what threats Otha or the company made about his job. And honestly, having been there myself and heard what we all heard, none of us blamed him one bit for that decision, even the guys who gave him grief about it to his face. Otha called the shift early that night, wrote equipment trouble on the official report, even though there was nothing actually wrong with any of our machinery. Every piece running perfectly fine when we finally shut it down properly and hauled out. I understood exactly why he lied on that paperwork, though, and I would have done the same in his position. Some things you run into 2 miles underground in the pitch dark, you do not go looking for further answers about. You just get your crew out safe, and you do not go back to that particular heading if there is any way around it. The company eventually mined that section out entirely through a different access route months later, after I'd already transferred to a different part of the operation, and nobody who worked that later heading ever said one word to me about what they may or may not have encountered down there, which honestly told me plenty on its own. I have been out of the mines for going on 6 years now, drawing my pension and doing some part-time work at a hardware store to keep myself occupied. And I still sometimes wake up in the middle of the night thinking I hear 3 slow, deliberate knocks coming from somewhere in my own house. My wife tells me it is just old habit left over from all those years underground. Muscle memory in my ears from 2 decades of listening for exactly that sound in the dark. I love her for saying it that gentle way, but I'm not so sure that explanation covers the whole of it, not after 7 East. If you have ever worked underground yourself, in a mine or a tunnel of any kind, or heard something you genuinely could not explain in any other job that takes you into the dark, tell us about it down below. This community has some of the very best stories in the comments section, and we make a point of reading every single one that comes in. Like this video, if it got to you the way it still gets to me, And subscribe because there is a whole lot more where this came from. Story 5. My name is Priya Anand, and I'm a storm photographer. I chase severe weather through the Appalachians and the Ohio Valley, and sell footage to news stations and stock agencies for use in weather segments and documentaries. It is a strange living, one my parents still do not fully understand or approve of, but I love it most days. That particular rush of standing in open ground watching something enormous and violent build itself out of nothing on the horizon. In May of 2022, I was tracking a supercell system moving through the Ohio River Valley near the West Virginia border, out past some old industrial land that used to house a munitions plant decades back, before it was decommissioned and largely reclaimed by scrub brush and chain link fencing that nobody bothered to maintain anymore. I had parked on an access road that ran along a stretch of overgrown fields and thin tree lines, a good open sight line for the storm building steadily in the distance, lightning already starting to walk visibly across the horizon, in long branching strikes that lit up the underside of the clouds every few seconds. I had my main camera set up on a tripod outside my car, getting time-lapse shots of the cloud structure forming and rotating slowly overhead, a technique I have used probably 200 times over the years without any issue, when my equipment started acting up in a way I had never experienced before. My camera's exposure kept spiking randomly, like something was flashing intense bright light directly at the sensor from somewhere close by, but there was nothing visible around me doing that. No other vehicles, no structures with working lights for miles. My phone, which had been sitting comfortably at 60% charge when I last checked it, dropped all the way down to 8% in about 4 minutes flat. Screen still lit and functioning the whole time, battery just draining like something invisible was pulling power straight out of it. Then I noticed the red light. Not lightning red, which flashes and moves and never holds steady. This was a steady red glow off in the tree line, about 200 yards out from where I was standing. 2 distinct points of light close together, roughly at head height if you pictured something standing upright at that distance. I assumed at first, reasonably enough, that it was some kind of reflector left over from the old plant, or a piece of abandoned equipment catching ambient light in an unusual way. I zoomed my long lens toward it out of pure professional habit, wanting a shot, regardless of what it turned out to be. Because you learn in this line of work to document first and figure out explanations later. Through the viewfinder, I could make out a shape, tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, based on how it filled the frame relative to the tree line around it. Wings folded close against a lean, upright body, and it was not moving at all, just standing there watching me watch it, patient in a way that felt distinctly unnatural for anything living in open air during a rapidly approaching storm. I felt something I can only describe honestly as pressure building behind my eyes, a headache blooming almost instantly from nothing, sharp enough that it made me physically step back away from my tripod, one hand coming up involuntarily to press against my own temple. The red lights blinked once, slow, deliberate, like an eyelid closing and reopening on its own unhurried timeline, and then the shape unfolded, wings spreading out wider than I honestly want to admit out loud even now. Wider than seemed physically possible for something that had looked compact just seconds before. And it lifted straight up off the ground without a single sound accompanying the motion. No wing beat displacing air that I could hear or feel. No rustle of branches as it cleared the tree line, just gone, rising up into the dark toward the building storm, as if gravity simply did not apply to it in that moment. I did not stay to finish my shoot, not even close. I threw my gear into the car, half of it not even properly broken down, tripod legs still extended, lens cap still off, and drove until I hit a truck stop about 40 minutes away, with actual working lights and other people milling around, needing that human presence more than I needed to explain to myself why. My footage from that night, when I finally worked up the nerve to review it a few days later, sitting safely in my own apartment, has almost 30 full seconds of nothing but red static right around the timestamp when I saw those lights clearly through my viewfinder. Like the camera sensor simply could not process or record whatever had actually been standing in frame in front of it. Local guys at the truck stop that night, when I mentioned in passing where exactly I had been parked, chasing the storm, got noticeably quiet, and one older trucker sitting at the counter told me that particular stretch of River Road has had sightings going back to at least the 60s, well before any of the more widely known cases people talk about online these days, and that folks around that area just call it the red-eyed thing and generally leave the explanation at that. No further elaboration needed or wanted, the way you might casually mention a dangerous curve in the road without needing to detail every accident that ever happened there. I still chase storms for a living. It remains my passion and my career both. But I check satellite maps and old sighting reports together now, before I ever pick a parking spot for a shoot, cross-referencing terrain against whatever local folklore I can dig up online beforehand. And I avoid that stretch of River Road completely now, storm or no storm, no matter how good the sightline might be for capturing footage. If chasing weather and something else entirely at the same time sounds like your particular flavor of nightmare, let us know down in the comments. And if this story earned it, hit that like button. It really does help the channel grow more than a lot of people realize. Subscribe if you want more of these dropping every single week. Story 6. My name is Homer Sizemore, and my family has run a legal distillery in the mountains of eastern Kentucky for 3 generations now. Though my grandfather ran it a very different way back before it was legal, up in those same hollers we still use for aging today. I grew up hearing him tell stories about things he saw running product at night through the back roads during Prohibition and its long aftermath. And I always figured it was just old man talk meant to entertain his grandkids, embellished with each retelling the way family stories tend to grow over the years. Until I had my own night out there in 2018 that made me reconsider everything he had ever told me at that kitchen table. We keep some of our aging barrels in a stone building set back off the main property, closer to the tree line than I would honestly like. But it happens to be the coolest and most consistent spot on the whole land, ideal for slow barrel aging that gives our bourbon its particular character. I had to go check on a reported leak one of our workers had flagged during the day, and I went out around 11 at night with a flashlight, a rag, and a spare bung in my pocket, figuring it would be a quick 15-minute fix before I headed back up to the main house for the night. While I was working on the barrel, crouched down checking the seal, I heard giggling. Kids giggling, high-pitched and echoing slightly against the stone walls, coming from somewhere near the tree line just outside the building. My first thought, same as anybody's would probably be in that moment, was that some local kids had wandered onto the property on a dare, maybe daring each other to sneak around the old distillery buildings the way kids have probably done on that land for decades. I stepped outside to look because that first thought felt like the reasonable explanation, figuring I would just send them home with a stern word and maybe a call to their parents if I recognized them. What I saw instead were 3 small figures moving between the trees, low to the ground, moving in a hopping, bounding kind of gait that no actual child moves in. More like something built wrong for walking upright, trying to cover ground quickly anyway. When one of them turned its head toward the edge of my flashlight beam, I saw its head clearly for just a moment, swollen and far too large for its narrow, undersized body, skin gray-colored and stretched tight over the skull underneath in a way that showed every contour of bone beneath it, and its mouth was open in that same giggling sound, stretched too wide, too many teeth crowded into a mouth that size for anything I could reasonably call a child. My grandfather's old stories came flooding back to me all at once, standing there, frozen in the doorway. He used to call them melonheads, and swore up and down they had lived in these particular hollers going back generations, tied to some old story about a hospital or an asylum that had once operated up in these mountains. Children who had been experimented on there, or simply abandoned when the place closed, and who had supposedly grown up twisted and wild, living out in these woods ever since, passing down whatever they had become to each other across the decades. I never knew how much of that story to actually believe growing up, Always assumed it was the kind of tale meant to keep grandkids from wandering too far off the property after dark, until I was standing there myself watching three of them circle just outside the reach of my flashlight. I backed slowly into the stone building and shut the heavy door behind me, through the old iron latch my grandfather had installed decades ago, for reasons I finally understood in that moment, and sat with my back pressed against a full barrel for almost 2 hours, listening to them scratch at the door and the single small window, giggling the whole while, until sometime after 1 a.m, it just stopped, all at once, like someone somewhere had switched it off entirely, silence rushing back in to fill the space where that awful giggling had been. I told my father the next morning over coffee, hands still not quite steady around the mug, and he did not seem surprised in the slightest, just nodded slowly and said that building has always had trouble at night, going back to his own father's time running it, and that this was exactly why Granddad never liked storing product out there long term if he could avoid it. Always tried to move barrels through that stone building quickly rather than let them age the full time they probably deserved. Nobody in my family goes out to that stone building after dark alone anymore. No exceptions made for any reason, no matter how urgent the barrel issue might seem to be. If your family has old stories passed down through generations that turned out to be more true than you ever wanted them to be, share them with us in the comments section. We absolutely love hearing that kind of thing from all of you. Like and subscribe if this story worked on you the way it still works on me every time I think about it. Story 7. My name is Ezra Combs, and I am a traveling preacher. I fill in at small independent churches across the mountains of North Carolina and Tennessee whenever a congregation does not have a regular pastor of their own, or needs someone extra for a revival week. Work that takes me to some of the most remote corners of this region most people never see or even know exist. This kind of ministry brings you into tiny churches sitting at the end of long gravel roads, congregations of maybe 30 or 40 souls who have worshiped together in the same small building for generations. And I've come to love that particular kind of work deeply despite everything I'm about to tell you. What happened to me happened outside one of those churches up in a holler in Swain County, back in October of 2020, during what was supposed to be a fairly routine week-long revival. I had finished a revival service late that particular night, close to 10 o'clock after a longer than usual altar call, and the church elder who normally handled locking up after evening services had taken sick that week with a bad cold. So the responsibility fell to me to make sure everything was properly shut down before I headed back to the small guest cabin where I was staying for the week. The church sat right up against old-growth forest, land that had historically belonged to the Cherokee before white settlement pushed further into these mountains. And the elder had mentioned to me earlier that same week, almost as a passing joke over supper, that I probably should not linger outside after dark this particular time of year, that the old people in the congregation used to talk about something they called a raven mocker that came around in the fall months especially, drawn to places where someone nearby was sick or dying, feeding somehow on whatever life remained in them. I did not think much of his warning at the time, filed it away as the kind of colorful local folklore you hear plenty of in this line of work, until I was locking the front doors of that little church and heard a sound overhead that stopped me completely cold in my tracks. A heavy wing beat, slow and deliberate, far too large and heavy sounding for any bird native to these mountains, circling directly above the church roof in a wide, unhurried pattern. I looked up and could not make out a clear, defined shape against the tree line and the thin, scattered clouds. Just a deeper patch of darkness moving steadily against the scattered stars, blotting them out one by one in a long, slow pass overhead that felt deliberate rather than random. Then I heard a voice, low and guttural, coming from somewhere near the tree line at the edge of the church parking lot. And it was speaking not the squawking or screeching cry you would expect from any large bird, but actual words strung together in what sounded like real speech, though I could not make out the specific language it was using, if it was using any human language at all in the strictest sense. It felt old in a way I genuinely cannot properly put into words even now. The kind of old that predates the church building I was standing in front of by centuries, predates the gravel road I had driven in on that week, predates most everything we consider permanent in these mountains. I am a man of deep faith, and I want to say that plainly and without embarrassment, because it matters to what happened next. I stood on those church steps and I prayed out loud, not quiet and internal, the way I might normally pray alone, but out loud and forceful, my voice cracking audibly on some of the words, as fear worked its way into my throat, despite my best efforts to keep it steady. The wing beats grew heavier for a long moment, closer than they had been, like whatever was up there circling was testing whether I would stop praying, seeing how far it could push before I broke. And then all at once, it lifted away entirely, and I heard it moving off deep into the ridge behind the church, wing beats fading gradually until the sound disappeared completely into the general night noise of the forest. I found the church elder the next day at his home, still nursing his cold, and told him plainly and in full detail what had happened to me the night before. And he did not laugh it off the way part of me had half expected or hoped he might. He told me, quiet and serious, that his own mother had died just 3 days after he himself heard that exact same sound outside her house one night when he was a boy of maybe 10 years old, and that among the older families still living in that particular holler, hearing it near a church building or a private home was never taken as anything close to a good sign, always understood as a warning of loss soon to come. He also told me, almost as an afterthought, that chilled me more than anything else, he said, that the elderly woman we had all been specifically praying for that entire revival week during our evening services had passed away just 4 days after my encounter, her family calling the church that following Sunday morning to share the news. I still travel and preach across these mountains. It remains my true calling, and I would not trade it for any other line of work, but I do not lock up alone after dark anymore. Not at that particular church, not at any of the others I regularly visit. Not since that October night taught me exactly how much of what the old folks say around these parts deserves to be taken seriously, rather than dismissed as simple folklore. If faith and genuine fear have ever crossed paths for you the way they did for me that particular night, tell us about it in the comments below. We read through every single one of them. If this story moved you in any way, give the video a like and subscribe for more real stories from folks all across Appalachia who have their own accounts to share. Story 8. My name is Colton Ferris and I'm a through hiker. I've completed the full Appalachian Trail twice now, once in 2017 and again in 2021. And I currently guide short sections for a small outfitter based out of Tennessee when I'm not out on trail pursuing my own hikes. Most hikers who spend enough consecutive nights alone out there in shelters eventually accumulate at least one genuinely strange story worth telling around a fire. But mine happened during a stretch through the Smokies that still bothers me deeply to think about, even years removed from that particular night. I was solo on a section hike in early spring, well before the trail typically gets busy with the main wave of through hikers heading north for the season, and I had a shelter mostly to myself for the night, sharing it with just one other hiker, an older man who had introduced himself politely enough over a shared dinner, but otherwise kept mostly to himself, reading by headlamp rather than making conversation. Around midnight, I woke up needing to step outside to use the privy, a normal enough occurrence on any multi-day hike. And when I came back toward the shelter afterward, I saw him sitting fully upright on the sleeping platform where he had been lying down when I left, which was strange enough on its own, except his head was turned almost completely around to watch me approach, further around than any human neck should reasonably be able to turn without serious injury. And he was smiling in a way his face had not once done during our entire evening of casual conversation before we settled in for the night. I stopped dead in the tree line at the edge of the shelter clearing, maybe 30 feet out from where he sat watching me, completely frozen in place. And he spoke to me using my actual first name, which I had mentioned to him earlier that evening in passing conversation. Said it slow and drawn out wrong somehow, like he was carefully testing how the word felt sitting in his mouth for the first time. Something about hearing my own name spoken that particular way made every single hair on my body stand up simultaneously, a full body reaction I had never experienced before or since in quite that intensity. I did not go back into that shelter, not for one more second. I grabbed my pack, which I had thankfully left sitting near the shelter entrance, rather than deeper inside near my sleeping bag, and I walked out into the pitch dark, completely alone, rather than spend even one more minute inside that structure with him. I hiked almost 4 full miles through the dark using just my headlamp for light, moving faster than I have ever moved on trail before or since that night, until I finally hit a road crossing and sat huddled under a highway underpass until sunrise finally broke, checking my phone every few minutes, even though I knew full well I had no signal out there, just needing something familiar and modern to hold onto in my hands, while I waited out the remaining hours of darkness. When I finally reached the next shelter the following evening, thoroughly exhausted from having hiked through most of the previous night, another hiker mentioned in casual conversation an older solo hiker who had reportedly been reported missing from a trailhead almost 2 entire counties south of where we currently were weeks earlier, according to the trail grapevine, with a physical description close enough to the man I had shared a shelter with that had turned my stomach immediately and completely. I do not know for certain what I actually spent that evening sharing space with out there. I have my own private guesses about it, and none of them let me sleep particularly easy even now, years later. I still hike regularly. It remains what I genuinely love doing more than almost anything else in my life, but I do not share shelters with unfamiliar strangers anymore, if I can possibly help it, choosing instead to camp separately, even if it means less comfortable conditions. And I never tell anyone my actual name anymore until I know them well enough over multiple days to trust it back in their mouth, without that same instinctive dread creeping in. If you have ever felt that deep gut instinct telling you to run before you even consciously understood why, drop it in the comments below. I promise you that you are far from alone in having experienced that particular feeling. Like this video if it kept your skin crawling the whole way through, and subscribe if you want to hear more trail stories like this one from hikers across the region. Story 9. My name is Bethany Okafor, and I am a large animal veterinarian working out of a small rural practice in Braxton County, West Virginia, a job I have held for almost 12 years now after finishing my veterinary training and specifically seeking out rural practice work over the more comfortable and better paying small animal clinics available in bigger cities. My job has me driving out to farms at all hours of the day and night. Calving emergencies and colic cases do not exactly wait politely for regular business hours, and I have made more midnight and pre-dawn drives down unmarked farm roads over the years than I could possibly count if you asked me to try. Most of those drives are completely uneventful, just tired driving through dark countryside thinking about the case ahead of me. One in the spring of 2019 was very much not uneventful. I got a call around 1 in the morning from a farmer named Hollis about a horse in serious distress, colicky and thrashing badly, according to his description over the phone. And his place was about 40 minutes out from my own home, up a road that ran alongside a creek bottom for a good while, before climbing steep and winding into open pasture land, higher up the mountain. Partway up that steep climb, my headlights caught something standing dead center in the middle of the road ahead of me, pale white in color, roughly the size and general shape of a standing person, but wrong in its exact proportions. Somehow arms noticeably too long for the torso, head slightly too small relative to the body beneath it. Standing perfectly still and watching my truck approach without any sign of alarm or movement. I slowed my truck down significantly, fully expecting it to move off the road the way any normal animal or even a person would naturally do when a vehicle comes bearing down on them at any real speed. It did not move at all, not even slightly. I came to a complete stop, maybe 40 feet away from it, and sat there in my truck with my high beams fully engaged directly on it. And it simply stood there bathed in that white glow, completely unblinking as far as I could tell from that distance. Its skin looking almost slick and wet, like polished wet stone catching the light. Then it tilted its head, slow, in a way that felt deeply unnatural, more like something being tilted on a mechanical hinge than any living neck moving under its own muscle control, and took one single long deliberate step off the road, directly into the creek bottom brush alongside it, and was simply gone from view. I sat frozen in my truck for a solid full minute before I could make myself press the gas pedal and drive forward again past the spot where it had been standing. When I finally arrived at Hollis's farm a short while later, still visibly shaken, I told him plainly what I had seen on my way up, because I was too rattled by that point not to say something out loud to another person. He went noticeably pale himself hearing my description, and told me that his family had lived on that particular piece of land for 4 full generations, going back to his great-grandfather originally settling there, and that his own grandfather used to call it the white thing of the creek bottom. Said it had been seen off and on around that property since well before Hollis himself was even born, always appearing near water sources, always exclusively at night, and that livestock had occasionally gone missing entirely without a trace of remains ever being found following certain sightings over the decades. We managed to get his horse fully stabilized that night after several tense hours of work, the colic ultimately resolving well with proper treatment and monitoring. But I remember distinctly that my hands were simply not steady the entire time I was working on that animal, and Hollis himself kept glancing repeatedly toward his open barn door every few minutes throughout the whole procedure, like he genuinely expected something to be standing silently in the doorway, watching us work. I still take farm calls out that same general direction because these families depend on me and my practice for their livelihoods, and I take that responsibility seriously, but I do not drive that particular creek bottom road alone after midnight anymore if I can possibly find any other viable route to a farm call. Even when the alternate path costs me a solid 20 extra minutes, I do not always have to spare during a genuine emergency. If you work a job that regularly has you out alone at strange and isolated hours the way mine does, I would genuinely love to hear about what you might have run into over the years. Drop it down in the comments below for us. Like this video if it got under your skin the way that night still gets under mine. And subscribe, because there are plenty more calls like this one still left to tell you all about. Story 10. My name is Vernon Aldridge, and I'm an antique picker by trade. I drive around rural Maryland, Western Virginia, and parts of West Virginia, buying up the contents of estates, old furniture pieces, farm tools, and anything else with genuine resale value. Then sell everything through a shop I run out of a converted barn on my own property. It is honest work that lets a man be his own boss, though it does put me in some strange old houses and stranger conversations with the families selling them off. In the fall of 2020, I bought out the entire contents of a farmhouse near Frederick County that had belonged to an old established family, all members deceased by that point, with the house itself going to auction separately for just the land value. Among the various items I purchased that day was a large iron bird cage, genuinely ornate work, clearly quite old based on the construction and materials, empty inside except for what looked like a scorched patch across the bottom, like something had once been burned inside it long ago and never properly cleaned out. The surviving family members who sold me the estate mentioned offhand, almost as a joke while we finished up the paperwork, that their great-uncle used to talk at length about something he called a snaily-gaster, described as a flying creature with a metal beak and a single central eye, said to snatch livestock and occasionally even people from that particular stretch of Maryland, going all the way back to colonial times according to the old stories, and that the cage in question had supposedly been built generations back by an ancestor specifically trying to trap the creature, though nobody remaining in the family took any of that story seriously anymore, treating it purely as amusing family folklore. I loaded the cage into my truck bed along with everything else from that haul, and did not think twice about any of it at the time, business being business and old family stories being a dime a dozen in this line of work. That night, driving the back roads home after dark to save some money on fuel rather than taking the interstate, I heard something land hard on the bed of my truck directly behind the cab, hard enough that the whole vehicle noticeably dipped down on its shocks from the impact. I checked my side mirror immediately and saw wings, folded but clearly massive even folded. catching what little light there was from my own taillights reflecting back, and something that looked distinctly like a curved metal beak dipping down toward my covered load in the bed. I did not stop to investigate any further. I put my foot down hard on the gas and drove considerably faster than I probably should have on those tight mountain curves. Whatever it was rode along on my truck bed for almost 2 full miles before I finally heard it lift off again with a sound like tearing sheet metal, gone off into the dark somewhere over an open field to my left. When I finally got home and checked the load in better light, the old birdcage had deep, fresh gouges scratched directly into the iron bars, bright exposed metal showing clearly through the old accumulated rust, gouges that had absolutely not been present when I originally loaded it into my truck that same afternoon just hours before. I sold that particular cage to another dealer out of state within the following week. Did not particularly care about my usual profit margin on the piece, just genuinely wanted it off my property and out of my possession as quickly as possible. I still work steadily as a picker. It remains a genuinely good living for me, but I have learned to ask a lot more careful questions about family stories before I load anything at all into my truck now, especially anything that spent multiple generations locked away specifically in a farmhouse attic rather than displayed openly in the house itself. If you have ever bought or personally inherited something that felt like it carried a lot more weight than its simple price tag ever suggested, tell us about it down in the comments below. Like this video if that particular story got to you the way it still gets to me, and subscribe for more accounts from folks who work the kinds of jobs that put them in genuinely strange places at strange hours of the night. Story 11. My name is Tasha Whitlock, and I volunteer with a civilian search and rescue group based out of Randolph County, West Virginia, entirely separate from any official park or forest service. We get called out regularly for lost hikers, missing hunters, and occasionally recovery work following bad storms that catch people out unprepared. I have been doing this volunteer work for 9 years now alongside my regular day job, and I have genuinely seen things out in these mountains that I do not include in our official incident reports. Because honestly, who exactly would believe it written down in an official document? And more practically, who would take our whole volunteer group seriously afterward if word got around? We got called out in November of 2021 for a hunter who had failed to return to his camp by the agreed upon time, and our search that particular night took us into a remote hollow well off any marked trail system, thick with rhododendron growth, the kind of terrain that genuinely swallows both sound and light both at once, making radio coordination between search teams unusually difficult. Around dusk, right before we would have had to officially call off the search for the night due to failing light, our team started seeing lights deep down in the hollow below our position, moving in distinct pairs, low to the ground, drifting steadily between the tree trunks in a way that no handheld flashlight or headlamp naturally moves, far too smooth and slow, almost appearing to float rather than being carried by someone walking. Our team lead called out toward the lights, reasonably assuming it might be the missing hunter himself, or possibly another search team working the same general area, and got absolutely no verbal response back, just the lights pausing together for a long moment, like they had actually heard the call and were considering it, before continuing their same slow drift deeper into the hollow away from us. One of our more experienced team members, a man who has lived in that particular county his entire life and knows these mountains better than almost anyone, told the rest of us quietly but firmly to stop calling out entirely, that those were not flashlights of any kind, and we genuinely were not going to want whatever might answer if we kept it up. He called them the hollow lights, said they had been seen in that specific drainage for multiple generations, according to local knowledge, tied to old stories about an entire family that had vanished somewhere up in that same hollow, sometime back in the 1800s, and was never found despite extensive searching at the time. We ultimately found our missing hunter about an hour later, alive but badly shaken, camped against a rock outcrop and refusing to move, even after our team physically reached his position. He told us, still trembling, that he had been following what he genuinely believed were other hunters' lights for almost 2 full hours trying to find his way back toward his own camp, before he finally realized the lights he was following were actually leading him steadily further away from any real trail, rather than closer to one. And he had the presence of mind at that point to simply stop moving entirely and hunker down rather than keep following them any further into unfamiliar terrain. We got him safely out of there that same night, and our official report understandably lists exposure and general disorientation as the cause, which is true enough as far as it officially goes, but every single one of us on that particular team knows full well what we personally witnessed, drifting through that hollow that evening, and none of us go into that specific drainage anymore, without at least 2 full teams present and full daylight remaining, no exceptions made, regardless of standard storm search protocol. If you have ever been part of any kind of search that turned up something you were genuinely not looking for or expecting, share it with us in the comments section. This community truly deserves to hear stories like that. Like this video if this particular one gave you chills, and subscribe for more real accounts from the mountains sent in by people just like you. Story 12. My name is Grady Ottinger, and I run the overnight shift at a small AM radio station out of Grayson County, Virginia, broadcasting mostly farm reports, gospel music programming, and call-in shows aimed at truckers passing through on the nearby interstate during the late night hours. Overnight radio work out here typically means being completely alone in a small station building at the edge of town most nights, which honestly never bothered me one bit until the winter of 2022 changed my entire relationship with that solitude. We had a listener call in around 3 in the morning that particular night, which is not unusual for our overnight slot. We regularly get insomniacs and lonely truckers just wanting someone to talk to during the long, dark hours. But this particular caller's voice was noticeably different from our usual callers, wet-sounding somehow, almost like he was speaking through standing water, and he kept insistently asking me if I could hear something moving in the swamp bottom directly behind our station building. I told him honestly that I could not hear anything unusual from inside my sealed studio booth, tried to keep the exchange light and professional the way I normally handle odd callers. But he grew increasingly more insistent as the call went on, saying something was definitely in the water down there. Something genuinely big, something that had apparently been circling closer and closer to the bank every single night that entire week. And he described it in detail as having far too many joints in its legs, moving wrong somehow, like a puppet being worked on strings rather than any real living animal moving under its own natural power. I laughed the whole thing off while still on air, purely professional habit at this point, after years of odd callers, thanked him for phoning in, and moved smoothly onto my next scheduled music segment without dwelling on it. About 20 minutes later, my direct studio phone line rang again. No caller ID showing this time at all. And when I picked it up, there was no voice on the other end whatsoever. Just a wet dragging sound, slow and distinctly rhythmic, like something genuinely heavy being pulled steadily across thick mud, growing progressively louder before the line abruptly went completely dead. I stepped outside briefly during my next scheduled song break, purely to check the parking lot and clear my head, a genuinely stupid decision looking back on it with clearer hindsight now. The low ground behind our building, which floods regularly into a proper swampy bottom for most of the year, had visible ripples moving steadily across the standing water, even though there was absolutely no wind blowing that particular night, moving in a straight and clearly deliberate line directly toward the section of bank closest to our building. I did not wait around to see whatever might surface from that water. I went straight back inside, locked every single door our building had, and finished out the remainder of my shift with every available light in that building switched fully on. The next morning, checking around before my relief arrived, I found tracks pressed into the mud near our back door, three-toed, notably deep, spaced apart in a stride considerably longer than any man's natural walking stride, leading directly from the water's edge right up to within just a few feet of our building, before abruptly turning back the way they had come. I mentioned finding these tracks to our station manager later that day, And he told me in a real matter-of-fact tone, with no surprise in his voice at all, that our particular building had actually been built on land that locals had always avoided historically for exactly that specific reason, referencing some old story about something that had long lived in that particular swamp bottom, going back multiple generations. Something folks around there just simply called the thing in the low ground, and generally left it at that without further discussion. I still work overnight shifts regularly. The job pays my bills reliably, and I have grown to genuinely enjoy the quiet solitude of it despite everything. But I do not step outside during my breaks anymore under any circumstances, and I keep every single door locked the moment I arrive for my shift. No exceptions made regardless of weather conditions. If you work nights yourself and have ever had something call in or happen that made your blood run genuinely cold, we absolutely want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments below for us. Like this video if this particular one worked on you, and subscribe it because the stories coming out of these hollers simply do not run out anytime soon. Story 13. My name is Jonas Petrakis, and I worked as a freight train conductor for a short line railroad, running coal and timber cars through the mountains of eastern Tennessee for almost 15 years before finally transferring to a desk position with the company a few years back. Night runs through those particular mountains take you through stretches of track that see absolutely no roads, no towns, nothing at all but dense trees and old timber trestle bridges for miles and miles at a stretch. And most nights out there, that reality just becomes background noise. You genuinely stop consciously noticing after enough years on the job. One run in December 2016, I have never once stopped noticing, not for a single day since. We were coming down a long, steady grade around midnight, moving slow because of the tight curve radius on that particular section. Our engineer up front handling the controls while I rode along in the second unit, working through some paperwork by dim cab light, when our headlights swept fully across something standing directly on the tracks ahead of us, far enough out that we had reasonable time to see it clearly before we would have reached its position. It was tall, easily 7 feet based on how it measured up against the surrounding rail infrastructure, standing perfectly upright, balanced directly on the rail itself. And it did not move at all as we steadily approached, did not startle or flinch the way any normal animal would, did not attempt to run for cover, just stood there, watching our massive engine come toward it with a kind of unnatural stillness that no living creature holds under a bearing down train of that size and weight. My engineer, a man named Walt, who had run these particular mountains for over 30 years by that point, and had seen essentially everything this job could throw at him, started slowing us down even further, hand resting on the horn control, and told me over our internal radio that he had seen something very much like this exactly once before, years back, on almost the same exact stretch of track, and that whatever it actually was had stepped clear off the rail just before impact. Both times he had personally encountered it over his long career, always waiting until what felt like the absolute last possible second, like it genuinely wanted to test how close it could safely let the train get before finally moving. Sure enough, at what felt like an impossibly close distance by that point, it stepped calmly off the rail into the tree line, completely unhurried about it, almost lazy in its movement. And as we finally passed the exact spot where it had been standing, I looked out my side window and saw it standing just past the tree line, tracking our train with its head as we rolled steadily by. And in the split second, our headlight caught it dead on. I saw its eyes reflect back not white or yellow, the way most animal eyes do, but a deep, unsettling red, and its mouth was open in what I can only honestly describe as a wide grin, far too wide for any face that size to naturally accommodate. Walt did not say a whole lot after that particular moment passed, just radioed ahead to dispatch that we had encountered a trespasser near the tracks and kept our train moving steadily forward. When we finally hit the rail yard at the end of that particular run, he told me quietly, almost reluctantly, that some of the older conductors on that line used to call it the grade walker. Said it had been seen on that same general stretch going all the way back to when the line was first originally built in the early 1900s, always appearing near that one long curve specifically, always exclusively at night, and that at least 2 genuinely unexplained derailments over the decades on that line had happened on almost that exact same spot on the track. I stayed on that particular line another 4 full years after that night, and never personally saw it again myself over that entire time, but I never once rode that grade afterward without watching the tracks ahead of us the entire way through, and I always breathed considerably easier once we finally cleared that specific curve behind us. Story 14. My name is Dana Kowalczyk, and I have carried a rural mail route in Highland County, Virginia, for going on 14 years now, one of those long, looping routes that takes most of a full day to complete, because the houses are spread out so far apart along mountain roads that barely qualify as maintained. Most of my route runs through open pasture and thin forest, and I know every mailbox, every dog that will chase my truck, every pothole that will rattle your teeth if you hit it wrong. I mention all that because knowing a route that well is exactly why what happened to me on a foggy morning in November of 2019 still does not sit right in my head, no matter how many times I go over it. I was running my route earlier than usual that day, trying to beat a front moving in, and about halfway through on a stretch that runs along an old cemetery fence line before curving back into open farmland, I saw a woman standing at the edge of the road ahead of me, dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned dress, pale-colored, standing very still with one arm raised like she was flagging down a ride. My first instinct, same as anybody driving a rural route, was that her car had broken down somewhere out of sight, and she needed help. So I slowed down considerably as I approached. As I got closer, I noticed her feet were bare despite the cold, and her dress, which had looked pale gray from a distance, was actually stained dark down the front in a way that made my stomach turn once I registered what I was looking at. I stopped my mail truck maybe 20 feet short of her, hand already reaching for my radio out of pure instinct, and she turned her head toward me slow, and her face had no real features to speak of, just a smoothed over blankness where eyes and a mouth should have been, like unfinished clay. I did not wait around to process that any further. I threw the truck in reverse and backed up almost 50 yards before I found a wide enough spot in the road to turn around entirely, watching her the whole time in my mirror. She never moved from that spot, arms still raised, the entire time I reversed, and when I finally got turned around and looked back one more time before speeding off, the road was completely empty, no sign of her at all. I skipped that stretch of my route that day, doubled back later that afternoon after the fog had burned off and traffic had picked up, delivering those particular boxes with shaking hands even in broad daylight. When I mentioned what happened to one of my regular customers on that route, an older woman who has lived out there her whole life, she told me plainly that a young bride had died in a wagon accident right along that cemetery fence line back in the 1800s, and that folks around there have called her the Hollow Bride for generations, always seen on foggy mornings, always trying to flag down help that never comes in time. I still run that route because it is my job, and my customers count on their mail, but I do not stop for anyone standing along that fence line anymore, no matter how they are dressed or how urgent they look. And I always make sure I have a full tank of gas before I head out on foggy mornings now. If you have ever driven a regular route long enough to know it by heart, only to have it show you something that broke the pattern completely, tell us about it in the comments. Like this video if it gave you chills, and subscribe for more real accounts from the mountains. Story 15. My name is Terrence Ashby, and I have worked as the night janitor at a small rural school in Wise County, Virginia, for almost 9 years, cleaning classrooms and gymnasium floors long after everyone else has gone home for the evening. The building is old, parts of it dating back to the 1950s, with a wing on the far end that has been closed off for years due to structural issues nobody ever got around to fixing, before budget cuts made the whole question moot. I generally avoid that closed wing entirely, storage only, nothing that needs regular cleaning, which is exactly why what happened in February of 2020 still bothers me as much as it does. I was mopping the main hallway around 11 at night, radio playing quietly, to keep myself company the way I always do, when the music cut to static all on its own. No warning, no gradual loss of signal, just static replacing whatever song had been playing a second before. I turned to check the radio, and that is when I heard something laughing, coming from the direction of the closed wing, high and delighted sounding. The kind of laugh you would expect from a child on a playground, except stretched out too long, holding notes no human set of lungs could sustain without taking a breath somewhere in the middle. I walked toward the closed wing against every instinct telling me not to, purely because, as the only person in the building, I felt responsible for checking on any actual child who might have wandered in and gotten locked inside somehow. The door to that wing, which is kept locked with a padlock specifically because of the structural concerns, was standing wide open, padlock still hanging closed on the hasp beside it, like someone had simply passed through the door and locked both without needing to actually open either one. I stood in that doorway with my flashlight up and saw, at the far end of the darkened hallway, a figure standing perfectly still, tall and impossibly thin, wearing what looked like old-fashioned children's clothing that did not fit its proportions correctly at all, and it was grinning, mouth stretched into an expression far too wide for its narrow face, unmoving except for that same high laughing sound continuing to pour out of it without any visible breath being drawn. I did not investigate any further. I closed that door, and though the padlock had somehow been open when I arrived, I found it snapped shut again when I checked it the next morning during daylight, like it had reset itself sometime overnight. I mentioned what I saw to our head custodian, a woman who has worked at that school even longer than I have, and she told me quietly that the wing had been closed originally after a fire decades back that killed several students, and that night staff over the years have reported similar things happening near that same hallway more than once, always dismissed officially as old building settling or overactive imagination. I still work nights at that school because I need the steady paycheck, but I do not go anywhere near that closed wing anymore, for any reason, structural concerns or otherwise. And I keep my radio playing at all times now because silence in that hallway feels like an invitation I am not willing to extend. If you have ever worked alone in a building at night that had a part of it everyone quietly agreed to avoid, tell us why in the comments below. Like this video if it unsettled you, and subscribe for more stories like this one. Story 16. My name is Charlene Duffy, and I work as a farrier, shoeing and trimming horses across several counties in the Virginia and West Virginia border area, a trade I learned from my father, who learned it from his father before him, going back generations in our family. The work takes me to a lot of older farms with barns that have stood for well over a century, and most of those barns are perfectly ordinary, just old wood and older smells. One barn outside Bland County, Virginia was not ordinary, not in the slightest, and I only worked that particular property once, back in the summer of 2021. I had been called out to trim a small herd of horses belonging to an elderly farmer who had recently inherited the property from a distant relative he had barely known, and he mentioned to me almost apologetically while I worked that the horses had been acting strange ever since he took over, refusing to enter one particular stall at the far end of the barn, no matter how he coaxed them, eyes rolling white with fear anytime they were led anywhere close to it. I did not think much of it until I got to that end of the barn myself to check a gate latch, and I noticed strange marks scratched into the wood above that particular stall door. Symbols I did not recognize, carved deep enough that whoever made them had put real effort and time into the work. As I stood there looking at them, the temperature in that section of the barn dropped noticeably, enough that I could see my own breath despite it being the middle of a hot summer afternoon everywhere else on the property. Then I heard something moving inside that empty stall, shuffling against old straw that had not been disturbed by any horse in weeks, and a smell rose up, sulfur and something sweetly rotten underneath it, strong enough that my eyes watered standing there. I backed away from that stall without fully deciding to, some older instinct taking over from conscious thought, and as I did, I heard a voice, thin and reedy, whisper my full name, first and last both, which I had certainly never given to anyone on that property. I finished my work that day as quickly as I professionally could, and told the farmer plainly that I would not be able to take him on as a regular client, offering no real explanation beyond a vague excuse about my schedule being full. He did not push for details, and something in the resigned way he nodded told me he already understood more than he was saying himself. I later heard through other farriers in the area that the previous owner of that property had dabbled seriously in folk magic decades back, and that whatever he had called up or bound to that stall had apparently outlasted him considerably. I still shoe horses across a wide territory, and love the work as much as I ever have, but I keep a list now, quietly, of properties I will not return to for any amount of money, and that barn sits right near the top of it. If you have ever felt a place actively reject you the moment you set foot on it, share your story with us in the comments. Like this video if this one left you uneasy, and subscribe for more encounters from folks working across these mountains. Story 17. My name is Roy Talbert, and I work as a lineman for a regional power company, climbing towers and poles across some of the most remote stretches of West Virginia to keep electricity running to homes that most people never think twice about. Storm damage calls take us into some genuinely isolated terrain at all hours, and in October of 2022, a bad ice storm sent my crew out to a transmission line running through a deep gap in Tucker County that none of us had worked before. We arrived after dark, headlamps and truck lights the only illumination against a tree line so dense it swallowed everything past about 30 feet. While my crew lead was surveying a downed section of line, I climbed a nearby tower to check equipment higher up, and from that height, with a clearer view over the tree canopy in the moonlight, I saw something moving along the top of the ridge parallel to our line, upright, moving on two legs with an oddly gliding quality to its stride, covering ground far too quickly for anything walking normally. I called down to my crew lead, and by the time he looked, whatever it was had stopped moving entirely and turned to face directly toward our tower, standing motionless at a distance that should have made it impossible to tell it was watching us. And yet somehow I felt that attention as clearly as if it had been standing right beside me. Our equipment began acting strangely almost immediately after that, meters spiking with readings that made no sense given the line was still de-energized for our repair work. Radios crackling with something that was not quite static and not quite words either. My crew lead called the work for the night, safety protocol technically covering the equipment malfunctions, though I think every one of us understood the real reason underneath that official explanation. As we packed up to leave, I looked back up towards the ridge one more time, and the figure had closed maybe half the distance toward our position, without any of us seeing it actually move, still simply standing there watching. We finished that repair job 2 days later during full daylight with a much larger crew, and nobody said a word about what had happened that first night. Some things in this line of work you just do not put in the incident report. I've worked plenty of remote lines since then without incident, but I always check the ridge lines now before I climb, every single time, and I have never again worked past dark in Tucker County, if there is any way at all to avoid it. If your job has ever taken you somewhere remote enough to feel truly watched by something that should not have been there, tell us about it in the comments. Like this video if it gave you the creeps, and subscribe for more stories from people whose work puts them in the middle of nowhere. Story 18. My name is Marisol Delgado, and I have worked as an EMS driver and paramedic in rural Greenbrier County, West Virginia for almost 10 years, running ambulance calls across some of the most spread out and isolated terrain in the state. Most of our calls are heartbreakingly routine: medical emergencies, farm accidents, the occasional car wreck on a bad curve. One call in January of 2023 was not routine at all, and I have never fully explained it to anyone at work, beyond the bare facts required for our report. We got dispatched late at night to a report of a person down along a stretch of county road that runs beside an old abandoned railbed. No further details available. Caller had hung up before giving a clear location beyond that general area. My partner and I drove that stretch slowly with our spotlight sweeping the ditches, and about a mile in we found a man lying in the road, unmoving, dressed in clothing that looked decades out of date. The kind of work coat and boots you might see in old photographs rather than anything sold today. I approached to begin assessment, and as I got closer, I realized his skin had a grayish, waterlogged quality. Entirely wrong for someone freshly injured, and when I checked for a pulse, his skin was ice cold despite the relatively mild winter night. Cold in a way that felt less like exposure and more like something that had never held any warmth at all. Then his eyes opened, and they were completely clouded over, milky white from edge to edge, and he sat up slowly, joints moving with an audible, wet, grinding sound that made my own stomach turn violently. My partner, a longtime paramedic who has genuinely seen it all over his career, grabbed my arm and pulled me backward toward the ambulance without a word, moving faster than I've ever seen him move on a call. We got back in the rig and drove off without completing any assessment at all, both of us shaking too badly to speak for several minutes afterward. When we finally radioed dispatch to report an unfounded call, no patient located. The dispatcher on duty that night went quiet for a moment before quietly mentioning that the same call, same location, same vague description comes in every year or two along that stretch, and every single crew that has responded has come back with an identical story, or has simply refused to discuss what they found at all. I still run calls in that county because these communities genuinely need reliable emergency care, and I take that responsibility seriously. But I've made it known to dispatch that I will take literally any other call over one that comes in for that particular stretch of road, and thankfully my supervisor never asks me to explain why. Story 19. My name is Owen Bracewell, and I have worked as a licensed land surveyor across the mountains of southwestern Virginia for almost 20 years, running boundary lines for timber companies, private landowners, and occasionally county governments, trying to settle disputes that have been simmering between neighboring families for generations. It is quiet, technical work most of the time, walking straight lines through brush with a total station and a crew of 2, driving stakes and hanging flagging tape, checking old deed descriptions against what the land actually looks like on the ground. People do not usually think of surveying as dangerous or strange work, and for the most part they are right. But in October of 2017, I was contracted to run a boundary line on a large parcel in Buchanan County that had not been properly surveyed since the 1940s. And what my crew and I found out there changed how I think about that whole profession. The parcel in question sat deep in a hollow that locals apparently just called the quiet place, though nobody I asked could tell me exactly why, just shrugging when I pressed for more detail, the way people do when they know something but have decided it is not worth the trouble of explaining to an outsider. The old deed description referenced a corner marker set at a large chestnut stump, chestnut trees having been mostly wiped out by blight decades before I was ever born, which meant we would be relying heavily on more recent evidence, old fence lines, blazed trees, whatever physical clues we could find to reconstruct where that original corner actually sat. We started the survey on a Monday morning with good weather and made decent progress the first 2 days, running lines through fairly typical mixed hardwood forest, nothing unusual to report. It was on the third day, pushing into the deepest part of the hollow, where the original chestnut stump was supposed to be located according to our best triangulation, that things started feeling wrong in a way I struggled to articulate even to my own crew. The birds went quiet first, an absence I noticed only because of how present that sound had been the 2 days prior, a wall of morning birdsong that had simply stopped as if someone had thrown a switch. My 2 crew members, both younger guys I had worked with for a couple of years by that point, noticed it too, and we all found ourselves talking in lower voices without any of us suggesting we should. We found the old stump right around midday, mostly rotted through but still recognizable, exactly where our calculations suggested it should be. A small victory that should have felt satisfying after 3 days of work. As I knelt down to drive our new survey marker into the ground beside it, I noticed something in the disturbed soil, pale and smooth, and when I brushed away more dirt to get a better look, I realized I was looking at bone, several pieces of it, arranged in a way that did not look like any natural animal remains I had ever encountered in 20 years of walking through these woods. My crew gathered around, and one of them, a guy named Petey, who grew up locally and knew these hollows better than either of us transplants, went pale looking at the arrangement and told me quietly that we needed to leave those bones exactly where they were and finish our marker placement somewhere else nearby, close enough to satisfy the legal requirement, but not directly on top of whatever we had just uncovered. I asked him why, more out of professional curiosity than anything else at that point, and he told me a story his grandmother used to tell about that particular hollow, that generations back, a family living up there had simply vanished overnight, cabin found empty, meals still on the table, no sign of struggle or departure, and that search parties combing the area afterward had reported hearing something following them through the brush for days, without ever getting a clear look at it, something that moved low and fast, and seemed to specifically avoid open ground where it might be seen clearly. The family was never found, living or dead, and eventually people just stopped looking and stopped talking about it, much beyond calling that particular hollow the Quiet Place, a name that suddenly made a lot more sense, standing there, with pale bone visible in the dirt at my feet. We relocated our marker about 30 feet south, as Petey suggested, close enough for legal accuracy, and finished up our documentation as quickly as professional standards allowed. It was while we were packing up our equipment for the day, sun already dropping low enough to throw long shadows across the hollow floor, that I heard something moving through the brush parallel to our position, matching our pace as we worked our way back toward the truck, close enough that I could hear individual footsteps rather than a general rustling. Footsteps that had an odd double cadence to them, like something walking on more legs than the two I expected. None of us said anything out loud, but I noticed both of my crew members had gone quiet and were walking noticeably faster than our normal pace, close together rather than spread out the way we usually moved through brush. The footsteps kept pace with us for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes of actual walking, always staying just at the edge of visibility in the thickening brush, never quite showing itself clearly enough for any of us to say definitively what it was, though I caught glimpses of pale movement low to the ground more than once, movement that did not match the deer or bear I kept trying to convince myself it must be. We reached the truck just as full dark was settling in, and I have never in 20 years of fieldwork loaded equipment that fast, tossing gear into the truck bed without our usual careful organization, more concerned with simply getting inside the cab and locking the doors than with any potential equipment damage. As we pulled away down the old logging road that served as our access route, my headlights swept across the tree line one final time, and for just a moment, I saw something standing upright at the edge of the trees, pale and too thin, watching our truck depart with an attention that felt deliberate and aware in a way that no animal's gaze has ever felt to me before or since. We completed the survey documentation from the office over the following week, submitting everything required to satisfy the legal boundary dispute that had prompted the whole job in the first place. But I made the decision, and I stand by it fully, to never personally return to that hollow again, assigning any future work in that area to other surveyors in our firm without ever fully explaining my reasoning, beyond a vague reference to difficult terrain. Petey left the firm about a year later to take a desk job in town, and though we never discussed that day again directly, I noticed he specifically avoided any project that would take him back toward Buchanan County, and I never once pushed him on it because I understood completely. I still run surveys across these mountains regularly. It remains steady, honest work that I'm good at and mostly still enjoy. But I keep a mental list now of certain hollows and certain old family names attached to certain properties that I quietly decline to take on personally, handing those particular jobs off to other surveyors in my firm without offering much explanation. And in this line of work, among people who spend their careers walking remote boundary lines through forgotten corners of these mountains, that kind of quiet deferral is understood and respected without ever needing to be spoken aloud. Story 20. My name is Sherman Whitcomb, and I have driven a tow truck out of a small, independently owned garage in Pocahontas County, West Virginia, for going on 16 years now, handling everything from routine flat tire calls to hauling wrecked vehicles off mountain roads after serious accidents. Work that puts me out on some of the most isolated stretches of highway in the state at every hour of the day and night. Most nights are unremarkable. Breakdowns and the occasional drunk driver who slid off into a ditch. Routine work that pays the bills and lets me keep my own small shop running. One call in March of 2018 was different from every other call I have taken before or since, and I still have not found a way to fully explain it to my own satisfaction. I got the call a little after 2 in the morning from our dispatch service, a report of a stalled vehicle on Route 39 out past Marlinton. Driver requesting a jump start or a tow, depending on what I found once I arrived on scene. This particular stretch of 39 runs through some genuinely remote high country, minimal cell coverage, no residential development for long stretches at a time. Exactly the kind of road where you want a reliable tow service on call, because help is not coming quickly from anywhere else if something goes wrong out there. I found the vehicle about 20 minutes into my drive out, an older sedan pulled onto the shoulder with its hazards flashing. And as I pulled my truck in behind it and got out to assess the situation, I noticed something odd immediately. The car's engine was running, headlights on, hazards flashing, everything about it suggesting a fully functional vehicle, rather than one that had actually broken down. I approached the driver's side window to check on the occupant, and found the seat completely empty, no driver anywhere in or near the vehicle. Doors locked from the inside, according to my initial check, which struck me as strange, given nobody could have exited and locked the doors behind themselves without a key. I called it in to dispatch, reporting an abandoned vehicle situation rather than the roadside assistance call I had originally been sent out for. And while I waited on the line for further instructions, I heard something behind me on the road, footsteps approaching steadily from the darkness beyond my truck's headlight range. I turned, expecting to find the missing driver, returning from wherever they had wandered off to, perhaps a bathroom break gone wrong or a search for cell signal. But what I saw instead was a figure standing just at the edge of my headlight beam, tall and unnaturally thin, wearing clothes that hung wrong on its frame like they belonged to a different sized body entirely. And it was not walking toward me so much as simply existing closer with each passing second, movement that I genuinely could not track clearly, despite watching directly at it. I stayed on the phone with dispatch the entire time, describing what I was seeing in real time, my voice admittedly shaking audibly enough that the dispatcher, a woman named Connie, who has worked that desk for longer than I have been driving, told me flatly and without hesitation to get back in my truck immediately and lock the doors, skip the tow entirely. We would sort out the abandoned vehicle situation with the state police instead. I did exactly what she said, backing away from that stalled sedan toward my own truck without turning my back fully on the figure, which had stopped its approach the moment I started retreating, standing perfectly still at the edge of the light, like it was content to simply wait and watch rather than close the remaining distance. I got into my truck, locked the doors, and sat there for a solid minute, working up the nerve to actually drive away, watching that figure through my windshield the entire time. And it did not move again during that entire minute, just stood there facing my truck with an attention that felt heavy and deliberate. When I finally did pull away, driving considerably faster than the posted speed limit allowed on that curvy mountain road, I checked my mirror once and saw the figure had moved to stand directly beside the abandoned sedan. Close enough that if it had reached out, it could have touched the vehicle, though I could not tell if that was actually happening or just a trick of my own rattled perception in the dark. State police responded to that location about 40 minutes later, according to what I heard secondhand through my dispatcher the following day, and found the vehicle exactly as I had described it, engine running, hazards flashing, no driver ever located despite a thorough search of the surrounding area conducted the following morning in daylight. The car was registered to a man from out of state who had reportedly been driving through the area on a business trip. And to my knowledge, based on what little follow-up information ever made its way back to our garage, he was never found. his disappearance remaining an open case with the state police to this day, as far as I'm aware. I have taken plenty of calls on Route 39 in the years since that night. It remains part of my regular coverage area, and I cannot simply refuse to work a section of road that generates steady business for a small operation like mine. But I do not get out of my truck alone on that stretch after dark anymore without calling dispatch first and staying on the line the entire time I am outside my vehicle, a habit that has earned me some ribbing from other guys at the garage who do not know the full story. Ribbing I accept without complaint, because explaining the real reason would mean reliving that night in more detail than I care to revisit out loud. Story 21. My name is Faith Underwood, and for the past 11 years, I have worked as a tour guide at a privately owned show cave in eastern Tennessee, leading visitors through several miles of mapped passages that wind deep beneath the mountain, a job I genuinely love despite everything I'm about to describe. The cave system we operate is extensive, with a developed public tour route covering maybe 1.5 miles of passage. But the map system extends much further beyond that, into sections closed to the public for safety reasons. Sections that only staff with proper training and equipment are permitted to access for maintenance and exploration purposes. In August of 2019, I was part of a small team tasked with surveying a newly discovered passage that our owner hoped to eventually incorporate into an expanded tour route, work that took us well beyond our normal public boundaries into genuinely unexplored territory. Our team that day consisted of myself, our cave systems manager named Dwight, who has explored more of that mountain than probably any living person, and a contracted cave surveyor named Priest, who specialized in exactly this kind of mapping work for show caves across the region. We entered through a maintenance access point around 9 in the morning, planning a full day underground, working our way through the newly discovered passage, taking measurements and photographs to document what we found for future development planning. The passage itself was genuinely beautiful in its own way, formations unlike anything visible on our public tour, delicate and untouched by decades of visitor traffic. And for the first several hours, our work proceeded smoothly and even enjoyably, the three of us falling into an easy rhythm of measuring, documenting, and moving steadily deeper into the mountain. It was sometime after our lunch break, taken sitting on cold rock roughly 1.5 miles into the new passage according to our running measurements, that Dwight first mentioned hearing something that none of us could immediately explain. A low rhythmic sound that seemed to be coming from somewhere further down the passage ahead of us. Not quite like dripping water, not quite like any airflow pattern he had encountered in decades of caving throughout that mountain system. We pushed forward cautiously to investigate, professional curiosity overriding whatever hesitation any of us might have individually felt. And the sound grew steadily clearer as we advanced, resolving eventually into something that sounded disturbingly like breathing, slow and deep, echoing off passage walls in a way that made pinpointing its exact source genuinely difficult, despite how loud it had become. Priest, who had surveyed dozens of cave systems across multiple states over his career, stopped walking entirely at one point and told us quietly that in all his years doing this work, he had never once encountered airflow or water movement capable of producing a sound with that particular rhythm and consistency. We reached a large chamber roughly 2 miles into the new passage, our headlamps barely illuminating the full ceiling height above us. And it was there that our lights caught something that stopped all three of us in our tracks simultaneously. Along the far wall of that chamber, barely visible in the reach of our combined lamp beams, was what appeared to be a series of markings scratched deep into the rock surface. Not natural formations, but deliberate marks, arranged in patterns that none of us could readily interpret. And beneath those markings, partially obscured by natural rock formations that had grown up around them over what must have been an enormous span of time given the growth rate of cave formations, were what looked unmistakably like bones, arranged too deliberately to be the result of any animal, simply dying and decomposing naturally in that location. It was while we stood there processing what we were looking at that the breathing sound, which had continued the entire time at a fairly consistent volume, suddenly grew significantly louder, and all three of our headlamps, functioning perfectly just moments before, flickered simultaneously and then died completely, plunging us into a darkness so absolute that I have genuinely never experienced anything like it before or since. A darkness with actual physical weight to it, pressing against my open eyes in a way that made no logical sense but felt entirely real in that moment. We each carried backup lights as standard cave safety protocol, and I fumbled mine on with hands that were shaking badly enough that it took several attempts. And when light finally returned to that chamber, all three of our beams sweeping wildly in different directions, we saw nothing unusual at all. No figure, no movement, just the chamber exactly as it had appeared before the darkness fell. Bones and markings still visible along that far wall, breathing sound now completely absent from the space around us. Nobody spoke as we packed up our equipment. Nobody needed to. We made our way back out of that new passage in considerably less time than it had taken us to explore it, moving with a shared urgency that none of us acknowledged out loud, but that all three of us clearly felt in equal measure. Once we finally reached daylight again, standing outside the maintenance entrance, an afternoon sun that felt more precious than I can adequately describe, Dwight told us both plainly that, as far as he was concerned, that passage would remain unexplored and undeveloped for the remainder of his tenure managing that cave system. Official development plans be damned. And neither Priest nor I offered a single word of argument against that decision. I still lead tours through the developed public sections of that cave system, work I continue to genuinely enjoy, but I know now with absolute certainty that there is more beneath that mountain than any of our maps will ever properly document. And some of what waits down there, in that undocumented dark, is better left entirely undisturbed, regardless of how many additional tour dollars a longer route might eventually generate for the business. Story 22. My name is Garrett Holloway, and I have worked as an agricultural aerial applicator, more commonly called a crop duster pilot, across the Flatter Valley farmland, tucked between the ridgelines of western North Carolina for almost 14 years, flying low passes over tobacco and cornfields at hours that make the most sense for spray application, often meaning very early morning, before wind conditions become unpredictable later in the day. Most of my flying happens right around dawn, engine roaring low over open fields while the surrounding mountains are still cast in deep shadow, and I've grown accustomed over the years to seeing those ridgelines from an unusual vantage point most people never experience. What I saw from the air on a September morning in 2020, flying a routine application pass over a tobacco field that backed directly up against National Forest boundary land, has genuinely changed how I feel about flying that particular section of valley ever since. I had taken off well before sunrise that morning, standard practice for beating the wind, and was maybe 40 minutes into my scheduled work when I banked my small plane around for another pass over a field that ran right along the base of a steep ridge, dense forest rising sharply just beyond the field's edge. As I leveled out low over the crop rows, engine noise loud enough in my headset that I would not have heard much of anything happening on the ground below me anyway, I noticed movement along that tree line at the field's edge. Something large moving parallel to my flight path at a speed that genuinely should not have been possible for anything traveling on foot through dense forest terrain. I banked slightly for a better look, professional habit overriding any hesitation, flying low enough on these application passes that details on the ground are often clearly visible if you know where to look. And what I saw moving through that tree line, keeping pace with my aircraft for a solid 10 seconds before I finally pulled up and away, was a shape that I still struggle to properly describe even now. It moved on two legs but covered ground with a bounding, almost gliding stride that ate up distance far faster than any two-legged creature I have ever observed. Dark-colored, easily matching the height of the smaller trees it moved between. And for one brief moment as I passed directly overhead, it tilted its head upward to track my aircraft. And even from that height and speed, I felt distinctly and uncomfortably certain that it was looking directly at me, rather than simply reacting to engine noise, the way wildlife typically does. I finished that particular application run because professional obligation and a genuine need to complete the contracted work overrode my rattled nerves. But I gave that specific tree line a much wider berth on every subsequent pass, adjusting my flight pattern in a way that probably reduced my spray coverage efficiency slightly, but that felt entirely necessary given what I had just witnessed. When I landed back at the small private strip I operate out of, I mentioned what I had seen to the farmer who had contracted the work, a man whose family has worked that particular valley for multiple generations. And he went quiet for a long moment before telling me that his own grandfather used to warn against letting cattle graze too close to that same tree line, claiming something living up in that ridge would occasionally take a calf if the herd wandered too near the forest edge during calving season, a story the farmer himself had always assumed was simply an old excuse for predator losses that were more likely coyotes or the occasional bear. I have continued flying application work across that same general valley in the years since. It remains a significant portion of my regular client base, and I cannot simply abandon contracts over a single strange morning encounter. But I fly that particular field differently now, approaching from a different angle that keeps more distance between my flight path and that specific tree line, and I make a point of completing that job earlier in my rotation when there is still enough dawn light to see clearly, rather than pushing it to the very edge of legal flying visibility, the way I sometimes did before that September morning. Other pilots I know who fly similar routes across these valleys have quietly admitted to me, after enough drinks at the hangar, to loosen actual honesty, that they too have specific stretches of ridgeline they avoid flying too close to for reasons none of us like to discuss in much detail during regular daylight conversation. Story 23. My name is Ivy Rasmussen, and I have worked as a taxidermist out of a small shop in Nicholas County, West Virginia, for almost 22 years, a trait I learned from my father, who ran the same shop before me, mounting deer heads, game birds, the occasional black bear for hunters across the region who want to preserve a trophy from a successful season. It is careful, patient work that requires a genuine understanding of anatomy and a steady hand. In over 2 decades, I have handled more dead animals than I could possibly count. In November of 2021, a hunter brought me something that did not belong in that count at all, and the several weeks that followed have permanently changed how carefully I now screen the specimens I agree to work on. The hunter, a man I had done work for several times previously, and generally trusted to bring in legitimate legal game, arrived at my shop with something wrapped heavily in a canvas tarp, telling me up front that he had taken it while bow hunting on private land, up near the state forest boundary, and wanted a full body mount done as quickly as I could manage it, offering to pay considerably above my usual rate for expedited work. When I finally unwrapped the tarp in my workshop to properly assess the specimen, I found myself looking at something that genuinely did not match any animal I could readily identify, despite 2 decades of professional experience handling regional wildlife. It had a build somewhat similar to a large canine, but the proportions were wrong in ways that immediately unsettled me. Limbs too long relative to the torso, a skull shape that suggested something closer to primate structure beneath the fur, and teeth, when I examined the mouth more closely, that included several that looked disturbingly close to human dentition, mixed in among more obviously predatory teeth. The hunter, when I pressed him for more details about exactly what he believed he had shot, grew visibly evasive, eventually admitting that he genuinely did not know what it was himself, only that it had approached his tree stand under circumstances he described as deeply unsettling, moving in a way that had made him fire out of pure panic rather than any deliberate hunting decision. Against my own better judgment, driven partly by professional curiosity and partly by the substantial payment already offered, I agreed to begin preparation work on the specimen, starting with the careful skinning process that forms the foundation of any quality mount. It was during that first evening, working alone in my shop after regular hours, radio playing quietly the way I always keep it while I work, I began hearing sounds from the walk-in cooler where I had stored the specimen between work sessions, scratching and shifting sounds that no properly deceased animal should be capable of producing. I told myself repeatedly that I was hearing settling equipment, normal cooler operation noise that I simply was not accustomed to, given how unusual this particular specimen already had me feeling on edge. But the sounds continued and even intensified over the following 2 evenings I spent working on that mount, culminating on the third night in a low, guttural sound from inside that cooler that I can only describe as something between a growl and an attempt at human speech, syllables I could not clearly make out, but that carried an unmistakable intentionality behind them that no simple animal vocalization should possess. I called the hunter the next morning and told him plainly that I could not complete the work, offering to refund his deposit in full despite the hours that I had already invested, and he did not argue or push back at all, accepting my decision with a kind of resigned understanding that suggested he had half expected this outcome from the start. He came to collect the specimen that same afternoon, and I watched him load it back into his truck with visible relief on both our parts, and I have not seen or heard from him since, though a mutual acquaintance mentioned to me some months later that he had reportedly sold his hunting property entirely and taken up fishing exclusively instead. I still run my shop and take on new work regularly. It remains the only trade I have ever known, and I'm genuinely good at it. But I now ask considerably more detailed questions about exactly how and where a specimen was taken before I agree to accept any new work. And I've adopted a firm personal policy of declining anything a hunter cannot clearly and confidently identify by species before it ever crosses my workshop threshold. A policy that has cost me a small amount of business over the years, but that I consider entirely worth the peace of mind it provides me every single evening I lock up that shop and walk away from it. If you have ever worked a job where the powerful machine you personally operate suddenly felt very small and insignificant against whatever was standing directly in front of it, tell us about it in the comments below. We read through every single one that comes in. If this whole series of stories has kept you up tonight the way we hope it has, do us a real favor and smash that like button. Leave us a comment telling us which specific story got to you the most out of everything you just heard. And if you have not subscribed to this channel yet, now is genuinely the time to do it, because Park Ranger Files has a whole lot more of these accounts still coming. And next time it might just be your own backyard we end up talking about. Stay safe out there, keep your doors locked tight, and we will see you all in the next one.